Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we want to talk a little Venezuela. A little international politics, economics, international diplomacy. How the left should be thinking about this sort of crisis, which is a combination of what I would say poor planning on the part of the Venezuelan government and commodity price trends and the Trump administration conducting a kind of economic warfare and diplomatic warfare on the Venezuelan government as well. And how the left should sort of, in my view, take into account the mistakes of the Venezuelan government, while at the same time absolutely condemning any proposed imperialist aggression against Venezuela, and to trying to keep our big stinking nose out of that business.
Right. It's kind of the political equivalent of walking and chewing gum at the same time, figuring out how to critique imperialism and also understand that Maduro isn't necessarily the best representation of leftism, nor is Venezuela in many ways now or in the past the best ideal for what socialism should be. So it's a complicated thing, and it's worth teasing out.
Yes, and I think if everyone could agree on that, agree on those 2 points, number one, and most importantly by far, that any sort of proposed military intervention or I would say even the sanctions they're putting on Venezuela are totally illegitimate. We should not be interfering with that country at all. Let them sort out their own business to the greatest possible extent. Maybe in a different world, we could imagine trying to sort of like broker some sort of a deal with Mexico and Bolivia to be like, look, let's all be friends here or something like that. But like Trump is president, that's not going to happen. The key thing is to stop any sort of like military coup backed by the U.S. And at the same time,
right, first.
Yes, that's number one. Number one, and really, I would say probably the only very important thing that Americans can do. But at the same time, insofar as it is important, and I think it is important to be accurate in our analysis and to be honest in terms of what is happening in the world, recognizing that Maduro has been a corrupt piece of shit. Like, he has fucked up Venezuela real bad. And he, in fact, had fucked it up long before the U.S. put any sort of sanctions on Venezuela, which happened in 2015. And the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela only because he was doing some fairly shady, manipulating the constitutional machinery after his party was waxed in the 2015 parliamentary elections. And so trying to keep those two things in view, I think, is it's an important intellectual exercise in trying to figure out where people should position themselves and how people should think about this is, I think, a kind of an important topic.
Right. Especially tricky for anyone, but on the left, to figure out to take on the challenge of a nuanced view of things when your interlocutors or opponents are being intellectually disingenuous and dishonest. So the temptation is, of course, to be equally dishonest just for rhetorical purposes. But that's a temptation to be avoided if you really want to win at the end of the day, I think.
Yeah, and so that's why we've got we brought on here Patrick Iber, who is a historian of Latin America. Has written extensively on the history of American imperialism in Latin America, which is, as he will tell you, to some of those details, very long and very bloody and oppressive indeed. but he also has no illusions about the nature of the Maduro presidency and how Venezuela got to where it is, which is not 100% the fault of American imperialist aggression. That's just a factual matter. And so, yeah, you want to bring him on, talk to him about it. Unfortunately, Alexei couldn't be present for this one because this had to happen during the day. But I got to talk to him, and so let's go ahead and roll that while we're at it. I guess maybe just start out by telling us a little, give us a little biography here. Where you come from, what your work is, and such.
Sure. I teach history. I teach Latin American history and U.S. foreign relations at the University of Wisconsin. Um, my area of expertise is not Venezuela in particular, but the history of U.S. foreign relations and its actions in Latin America more broadly have been the subject of my research for a few years. I wrote a book a few years ago called Neither Peace Nor Freedom, The Cultural Cold War in Latin America, which was about artists and writers, intellectuals' engagement with Cold War politics. And it's been surprising to have been watching the events unfolding in Venezuela and seeing a number of parallels between the kinds of civil society organizations that were involved in that kind of Cold War conflict and some of the problems that people are facing today. It's in one of those unexpected times where historical study suddenly seems to be sort of jumping out of the pages of newspapers and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. I thought, I thought we could start just maybe by doing. I could give you kind of my capsule sort of take on the last few years of history in Venezuela, and just to give us a little bit of background, and you could maybe correct me as needed.
Sure.
So, Venezuela's. Maybe you start with Hugo Chavez was the president for many years, up through he died in 2013, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah. And right about the end of his presidency in 2013, Venezuela started to experience some pretty severe economic problems. And from what I can tell, there is basically two things going on. Number one, that Venezuela had basically been funding a lot of its basic government expenditures, its state revenues through oil sales. And number two, after Chavez died, especially, they had this price control system, which some of his successor Nicolas Maduro basically used. They abused the price control mechanism to just basically steal a lot of that oil money. And the result was a huge shortfall in revenues, basically, to sort of run the country. And they try to cover the difference by printing. And that caused a lot of inflation and shortages and such. And so there was a big backlash, big protests in 2014 against Maduro, who was Chavez's handpicked successor, if I'm not mistaken. And in 2015, there was parliamentary elections for the National Assembly, and Maduro's party, the ruling party, got absolutely stomped. They lost by they lost. What I think they got.
It was they had 56% of the opposition had, I believe, 56% of the vote, and it translated to almost two-thirds of the seats.
Yeah.
In the assembly, which was the system. The Constitution had been written by Chavez, so that was the system that the ruling party had put. That was their constitution. that set up
Right.
those
Yes.
rules. But yeah, they lost by a substantial margin in those elections.
And so Maduro and his party basically responded with a lot of sneaky shenanigans. Basically, they put some cronies on the Supreme Court, and they sort of disputed the results of a couple of elections to stop the opposition from having 2/3 in the National Assembly, and that. Go ahead.
Right. So I think there were 3 seats in particular that were disputed. They alleged that the opposition had engaged in fraud and used their own judges, which they had, throughout the judicial system have been placed, over the years and appointed by Chavez and his successor Maduro, as you said, to essentially knock out 3 seats, which prevented the opposition from having a 2/3 majority, which would have allowed them to potentially recall and remove Maduro from office. So that was what it was at stake in that election. The only thing I would add to what you said before is that the exchange rate, the arbitrage system predates Maduro. That was something that was there under Chavez too, and was used strategically to give favored people access to preferential exchange rates. That's one of the things that has been causing economic problems. But you're certainly right that the gravity of the economic crisis has intensified after Chavez's death in 2013. That there was inflation under Chavez and shortages that were there under Chavez, but not the kind of massive hunger that is driving people to leave the country by the millions, nor the hyperinflation that you have today. I mean, there was 40%, 70% inflation under Chavez. It's 1,000,000% last year. So that's a big difference.
Yeah, my sort of sense of it is that under Chavez, there was a lot of insiders, getting a taste of the oil money, but like the people got most of it. And under Maduro, it's gone the other way around.
I think that's a fair characterization. I mean, it's certainly the case that if you looked at the Chavez years, and there were people all along, including voices on the left, who were critical of Chavez and the model of Chavez, but their critique at that time was that the money that was being spent could have been spent better.
Yeah,
that it could have been spent more responsibly. It wasn't that the poor were not benefiting. The social programs that the Chavez government put in place were helpful in improving the lives of the poor, and the poverty rates went down substantially under Chavez. They went down into the 20s or the 30s, having been much higher than that. Now the estimate is hard to get good estimates now. But now they're in the 70s or 80s. I mean, they've gone way up under. So you did have a real decline in poverty under Chavez. The social programs were really welcome. Some of them were not effective, but by and large, the general orientation of the government was one that benefited the poor. And levels of inequality also dropped substantially. There was a time in which it was asserted that Venezuela was the most equal country by its Gini measure in the hemisphere. That always never took account for Canada, which is lower, but it seems to have been down in the high 30s, which is low for Latin America, for the Americas in general, where we tend to have very high measures of inequality.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I don't have any idea how you would measure that today, given that the statistics are not available or reliable, but we know that poverty rates have skyrocketed. So that's the situation that people in Venezuela are facing. Yeah.
And as after 2015, when there's this like pretty extra constitutional meddling with the trying to sort of somewhat overturn the result of the election, then the U.S. slapped some sanctions on certain businessmen and Maduro sort of allies. and then this is like it all starts to bite in harder because like oil's lower, and now they're getting sanctioned, and they're just printing more and more to cover up the difference. And so as you were referencing before, inflation starts to go up and up and up. And the protests, the popularity of Maduro has fallen, and various kind of conservative right wing forces who maybe are not terribly sympathetic to poor people or democracy in general have started, making noises about a coup or, something like that. But on the other hand, Maduro is inspiring these massive protests. So there's a genuine popular groundswell there at the same time. And in, let's see, was it 2018? There's another election, right?
Yeah.
And that
right.
one. Go ahead.
Right, a presidential election that time, and the elections weren't fair, and weren't going to be fair, and were set up to be won by Maduro under any circumstances. And so there was an opposition candidate, but didn't receive unified support, and so Maduro won the election. But the opposition had boycotted. It's a strategy that they have used before when they decided that the conditions of the election were illegitimate. At other times, that gave Chavismo huge majorities, huge electoral majorities that it could work with. But this time, the strategy has been essentially to create this crisis situation in which there are now two claimants for democratic legitimacy. On the one hand, Maduro, who can point to the last presidential election, and then the head of the National Assembly, this guy Juan Guaido, who has declared himself the constitutional leader, has declared himself the president, essentially, according to his interpretation of the Constitution. And the legal issues are so complex and depend on so many matters of interpretation. Even you can look at the clause of the Constitution and say, well, when fine, but when is it the case that somebody like Maduro would not be considered to be the legitimate president? Or there's nothing in the Constitution that tells you what to do when there's a fraudulent election, if that's what you want to call what happened in 2018. So it's a sort of unprecedented situation in which these two political figures, Maduro and Guaido, are saying that they're the ones that have the democratic legitimacy, and then basically trying to make it happen. Guaido is trying to assemble a coalition that will allow him to claim that legitimacy, and Maduro is trying to hang on to the parts that remain of his coalition, primarily the military, which is the main thing that hasn't abandoned him. I should say, in response to what you said earlier, just briefly, that the opposition's commitment to democracy is not something of long standing. I mean, there was an attempt to remove Chavez in 2002. He was, I think, 48 or 72 hours, a couple of days before people marched down, sort of restored the Chavez presidency. That was something that the Bush administration immediately sort of recognized the government of the businessman who took over from Chavez. So there are claims to democratic legitimacy on all sides of the political competition here. And even the words that we use to describe them, like right-wing and left-wing, would be strongly contested in different situations. I mean, it's very difficult for a lot of people to associate Maduro's program, the huge increases in levels of poverty and corruption. It's very difficult for people on the left to say, well, yes, I mean, this is what I identify as they call themselves socialists, okay, but is this really a left-wing program? On the other hand, Guaido comes from a party which belongs to the Second International, and they're
really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he does. The program that he would put in place I don't think would be a ferociously reactionary program, though of course that remains to be seen. And this is one of the things that we'll probably get into as we go throughout the conversation. I mean, it all depends on where you assemble the political power. What kind of coalition can you put together? Where is it going to come from? And what is true about Guaido and the party that he comes from, which are sometimes described as the right wing in Venezuelan politics, he seems to be tutored by Leopoldo Lopez, who's an opposition figure who is most closely associated with procedural radicalism to try and force Maduro from office, tried to get that result out of protests that happened in 2014. And Guaido seems to be sort of very close to Lopez, who's been under house arrest since those very controversial protests that led to deaths both on the government and the protest side. So exactly how one situates these people ideologically is even one of the it can be a difficult thing. You can understand both why people want to associate Guaido with the right wing, and for procedural reasons that makes sense, but it's not necessarily in terms of the program that his party supports.
Yeah,
it's difficult to say. I mean, there would certainly be some sort of. I mean, you would expect almost any government that would come in next would have to undergo some sort of economic shock treatment that people might end up describing as neoliberal. But
yeah, the for folks who don't know, the Second International, correct me if I'm wrong, is this sort of like holdover from the old days of international socialism from like after the First World War, if I'm not mistaken, and it's got like the Social Democratic Party of Denmark and all the kind of those socialist institutions from back when they maybe were actually more socialist, almost totally moribund now, I would say. Doesn't really do anything. But it's not definitely a military right winger would not want to be associated with that necessarily.
Right. I mean, that's right. So these are the moderate socialists. These are the non-communists during the Cold War. The Third International people, know of the Comintern, the Communist International. The Second International were the sort of social democrats who were opposed to communism. And so now the issue with the Second International, which has seen defections and I mean, the DSA convention in Chicago, I think DSA disaffiliated from the Second International, just as an example of, dissatisfaction with the sort of, I don't know, third way socialism sort of thing that the Second International represents. So, at the same time, it's all that may be true. I mean, it's just helpful, I suppose, in situating ideologically where some of the opposition is coming from. It's not necessarily, I don't know, libertarian in orientation or something like that, but has a sort of social democratic ethos, if not any kind of plan that's going to get you to social democracy.
Yeah, but bland center left. I mean, like Labor parties type.
A laborist parties in there, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so that brings us to sort of present day. After that disputed election, Trump slapped a bunch more sanctions on them, and now suddenly he's talking about some kind of military intervention maybe. He's recognized Guaido, or a bunch of Europeans have also done that. And he's appointed Elliot Abrams, who was like a Contra killer guy, basically, running death squads in Nicaragua, as his sort of like, Venezuela guy. And, that just like extremely bad sign, and I suppose that sort of sets up the general question, which, I take it as a given that any lefty or center lefty, or even, anybody with any sort of conscience or sense should absolutely oppose any kind of military intervention. And I think the sanctions aren't doing anything good either. the best, especially with Trump as president, it seems to me like he couldn't possibly do anything right, that we should just probably leave to the greatest possible extent, just leave Venezuela to sort out its own business at this point. But there is a sort of a question of how the left should sort of, Venezuela still is sort of being treated as this like football in the domestic political discourse, and there's a question about how the left should sort of position itself regarding Venezuela, because I think it crosses a lot of political wires, and I think people have been getting like tangled up about it.
Yeah, people have really been getting zapped.
I can testify to that.
Yeah, I think so. I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been observing that and thinking a lot about some of the reasons why that might be, because it seems almost impossible for people to articulate something which doesn't seem to have some kind of problem with the way that it's expressed. Now, on the one hand, this has sort of been true of Venezuela for a long time. It's been an easy way to provoke anger in international left circles, is to say almost anything about Venezuela, is to invite a spirited response. And I think in part, so one of the things that I think is happening is that the international left and the U.S. left, and especially people who work on Latin America, are extremely cognizant of the history of U.S. imperialism in Latin America and around the world. And there are ways in which this looks and is, I mean, to say, by saying that it looks like that old pattern, I mean, it is that old pattern. And that pattern hasn't, it has changed in some ways from the height of the Cold War, but there are other ways that it is continuous with Cold War policy. Your example of Elliot Abrams, who's now in charge of democracy promotion in Venezuela. I mean, give me a break. This is the guy, this is a guy who, when he worked for the Reagan administration, denied the massacres that were being carried out by right-wing death squads that had been trained by the United States in El Salvador. And the reason that he did that, the reason that he was in denial about that, was that in Congress had put restrictions on the kinds of aid that the Reagan administration could give, as Democratic Congress, to Central America. They had to certify that the human rights conditions were being met. So that put him in a position of denying the violence that the right wing was inflicting on civilians and on those societies to horrific effect. It was really, really quite grotesque. And to now have this be the person who's in charge of democracy promotion in Venezuela should make everyone worried about what exactly that would, what kind of democracy somebody like Elliot Abrams would have in mind. This has been, that specifically that issue has been one of the main debates that the left has been having about Venezuela since the days of Chavez. That for many, Chavismo seemed to represent a kind of participatory democracy, an alternative model, that as opposed to the boring parliamentary procedural liberal democracy that people in the United States and Western Europe live with and experience its flaws all the time, and the kind of democratic deficits that come along with that form of democracy. The participatory democracy that Chavez claimed that he was building was seen as an inspirational alternative model. The fact that it had certain authoritarian characteristics, including the concentration of power in the hands of the executive, that have the consequences of which are partially now being lived out. Of course, other decisions have been made along the way, but are among the contradictions that people are dealing with as they try to figure out how to position themselves with respect to what's happening in this current crisis. If I could say one other thing about Abrams and the continuities, particularly to the Cold War, that I have been, that I've been observing over the while watching this crisis develop.
Sure.
I mentioned that I wrote a book about the cultural Cold War, and back then, from 1950 to 1967, the CIA was the part of the U.S. government that was responsible for civil society programs. And they had there's a branch of the CIA called the International Organizations Division that some people know because they funded arts programs, and abstract expressionism is supposed to be the art that represents freedom and things of that nature. And so people have sometimes some passing familiarity with that. And there's a group called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which existed during that time with a big CIA subsidy that promoted this idea of cultural freedom as being one of the values of the West, and what distinguished it from what distinguished the West from totalitarian states, including fascism. But since the fascist threat had been defeated militarily, then the threat of communism during the Cold War, that stuff was all exposed in '67, and it was supposed to be all closed down. But what the Reagan administration did in 1983 was to make the National Endowment for Democracy, which started operating in 1984, and the director of NED is a guy named Carl Gershom, who's the former executive director of Social Democrats USA. And so Social Democrats USA, again, this is like all leftist inside baseball, right? But that's the sort of right-wing socialists who broke off from Michael Harrington, who formed the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which later was folded into DSA today. And so the Social Democrats USA have a closer association with neoconservatism, sort of that edge of sometimes people describe them as like State Department socialists, and there are in fact direct personal links between the National Endowment for Democracy folks, of which Elliott Abrams is a participant, and that earlier era of Cold War democracy promotion through the CIA, which is not to say that the NED is the same as the CIA. They're more transparent, but they are funded. The basic thing that they do is the thing that the CIA did until it got caught in '67, which was to fund essentially pro-democracy front groups that would, especially when there were regimes were ones that the United States deemed strategically inconvenient. And so all the way back to the Chavez years in the early 2000s, Chavez would complain constantly about interference in what was happening in Venezuela by NED, because NED would be funding opposition newspapers or funding opposition party activities, and NED would say, well, we're nonpartisan, we're just defending democracy against an authoritarian leader. And Chavez would say, this is foreign electoral interference in a sovereign state. So the Cold War politics have not totally disappeared.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like what's the other one? Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is like every other day writing op-eds about how Saudi Arabia is an important ally, and the UAE, just absolute frauds.
Yeah, I mean this is where people are, on the left, I think, are struggling with how to confront this situation, because we have a government with Maduro that is genuinely repressive, where people and poor people, it used to be that there was a real class divide between opposition to Chavez and he had the support of the poor primarily and the distrust of the bourgeoisie. Of course, there were members of the bourgeoisie that found ways to accommodate themselves to the Chavez government. But it's very clear that in this last round of protests and also in the protests before this one in 2017, that class distinction has broken down substantially, that there's a huge amount of discontent among Venezuela's poor with the Maduro government. Whether that translates into support for the opposition has always been a separate question. And that sometimes gets confused in international discussion. Nancy Pelosi, I saw, was tweeting, so we're standing with the people of Venezuela. Well, I mean, what does that mean? What do you think the people of Venezuela want? That's the people of Venezuela who want democracy. Again, that's the whole problem. Nobody is clear on how democracy is going to be defined. I mean, it's something that everybody is trying to claim an association with, and everybody's claims are dubious. Maduro's claims are dubious by this point. Why those claims are dubious, and that's why there's this the political crisis is as deep as it is.
Yeah, and I guess like you saw me get in a dispute with Max Blumenthal and so forth about people were outraged at trying to point out the fact that Maduro is the probable victim of U.S. imperialism in a sense, but really before that even started, he was undermining democracy and just fucking up the economy, just doing a terrible job and being very corrupt. And I think that there's this knee-jerk, this tendency to just like romanticize people who are on the business end of Elliot Abrams, to think, well, they must be good or we must defend them. And that to me seems like a kind of I don't know, a fool's errand.
Maybe
this is the other thing.
Yeah,
this is the other thing that reminds me so much of the Cold War. That and here we don't have. Maduro is not Stalin.
No,
whatever. This is we don't there are political prisoners. There is torture. There is repression. Those things exist. But still, we have to bear in mind that keep a sense of perspective about what things are and what they aren't. But what it reminds me so much of somebody who would take the position of defending Maduro would be essentially doing what many communists and fellow travelers did during the early Cold War, when Stalin was still, before Stalin died in 1953, which was to know. They knew, some of them had visited the Soviet Union. They knew what was going on. They would come back to the United States and they wouldn't be willing to say what they knew about what was happening over there, because they felt like that would feed into right-wing narratives about the Soviet Union, that they were hoping for a kind of peaceful resolution of conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They were fearing the outbreak of a third world war, and so they felt like anything that they say badly about the Soviet Union at that time would be feeding into the hands of the enemy. And I feel like some people are getting into that kind of situation. So we've seen a number of statements. There was a statement that a number of my friends signed that Noam Chomsky was sort of lead signatory on, condemning what's happening, condemning the U.S.-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. And it's a sort of, on the one hand, Maduro has done these things that are bad, and on the other hand, the opposition has done these things that are bad. And sort of every sentence is true, and still some people feel like, well, it doesn't quite capture the fact that Maduro is the primary author of these policies and primarily responsible for the conditions that exist in Venezuela to today. I think that's correct. I think that Maduro is primarily the person who is primarily responsible, in spite of the imperial meddling, in spite of the which exists. But again, one has to keep that sort of thing also in perspective and not let that be overwhelm the kind of story, which is what Chavez did and what Maduro does, is try to make that the major thing, that to make the U.S. interference in our country is the big story that there's a capital strike by the wealthy that is responsible for our economic crisis, and those stories are those are exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Even when there's like most good propaganda, it works best when there's a kernel of truth. There's a kernel of truth, but it also leaves something to be desired. And so what I think is happening to people on the left is that their desire to stop U.S. meddling has sometimes led them to kind of soft pedal some of the crimes of the Maduro administration. And there's a sort of gap between what you would say if you were trying to explain the crisis in a sort of analytical, academic way, and what you want to say to have the most impact in a time of political crisis and tension. And that the gap between those two things means that anything that anybody says can be criticized from another position. And there it can be some validity to that criticism, because I am in complete agreement with the signatories who say that the United States should play no role in deciding who is the president of Venezuela, and that there's no planet on which I'm going to lock arms with Elliot Abrams and pretend that the democracy is going to be the likely result of that kind of activity. And at the same time, I think it's important to maintain some intellectual clarity and then to think about, what can be done. If you think about it from the point of view of Venezuela, people are hungry, people lack medicine. I mean, people are really desperate. That's why millions have left the country. What is the left obligation to solidarity? How do you get? How can you resolve this crisis in a peaceful way? And that's where I think that that what most people on the left have been saying, that the signatories to that letter that Chomsky was the lead signatory of, people like Representative Ro have said that we should support a process of dialogue between the opposition and the Maduro government. The government of Mexico and the government of Uruguay have also gotten behind that, and I think that that's essentially the best thing that the left can offer, but it has to do it should do it from a position of clarity about what's going on, and the fact that Maduro has in the past used negotiations to try and stall. So it's a tough situation. No question.
Yeah, worth pointing out that AMLO in Mexico has more or less the same position as the Chomsky letter and similar, Bernie Sanders and such, to say that like imperialism is bad, not terribly impressed with Maduro either, and
so some of my friends and colleagues and journalists in Mexico have really been upset with this position that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has taken, the relatively new, relatively left-wing president of Mexico, saying that this is, the betrayal of Venezuela or something like that, the Venezuelan people. On the more, the more liberal side of the spectrum, there's that kind of critique. I'm sorry, I think that misses what's going on. I mean, I think it's very important for a country like Mexico to maintain a possible open channel to different parties in this. In this situation, Mexico has traditionally played a role of an escape valve. It's a place that, that Maduro, were he to step down in some sort of as part of some broader agreement that would be an opportunity to host a kind of fair election and start in a kind of clean way to resolve this intense political crisis that Venezuela has been facing for years now, and to begin to resolve the economic crisis and so on. Maybe Maduro needs to step down and go somewhere else and Mexico could be a place that would, who could provide that kind of exile. And you might say, maybe some people don't like that, but that would be a good outcome for people in Venezuela who deserve, and poor people in Venezuela who deserve our sympathy. So
yeah, and I guess from my perspective, it's like the thing that is foremost in my mind when you're talking about international politics or domestic politics is like, what is true? And that is, I think, the thing that you need to keep in mind. And people have been disputing. It's like, is it necessary to point this out? Is it, are you sort of like secretly helping Trump? It's like, that's what people have accused me of. It's like, oh, you're just supporting, you're covering your Trump support with this, like, by saying that you don't support Trump because you're pointing out the Maduro making bad decisions. But I think also, if you are, like, I see sometimes on the left people saying Maduro is perfect, done nothing wrong. It's 100% the fault of U.S. economic imperialism. That could just discredit your opinion by being, as a matter of empirical reality, bullshit. And actually end up, undermining the case in that sense by making it sound completely wacky.
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of bad arguments that are out there floating around. I mean, that's certainly one of them. Part of another one. Venezuela, of course, has a ton of oil. I mean, it's part of the issue. They went through this cycle in the 70s, 80s, and 90s also, where there was a huge oil boom, a ton of social spending, then a price collapse, then huge protests. This is originally where Hugo Chavez came from in the first place, was leading a military coup against a failed military coup initially, and then he was elected president in fair elections 7 or so years later after that attempted coup in 92. So there's a kind of inherent there's a problem in the foundations of the economy associated with being a kind of with being oil dependent, and that's certainly something that Chavez did not break. That Maduro has certainly not broken, and that has been one of the major discussions among people on the left and the Latin American left, is thinking about how much of these pink tide governments depended on high commodity prices and extractive economies in order for their social spending. And in the future, as we need to both reduce dependence on fossil fuel consumption, so on, obviously to deal with the devastation, the coming devastation of climate change, current and coming devastation of climate change, and also to think about how we improve the lives of people in poverty, how we make more equal societies, less socially divided ones. We need some kind of different models to think about. But I don't think it does anybody any good to deny the realities of what has happened and what has gotten us into this, what has gotten us, and by us I mean people on the left, and into this situation.
Yeah. And this, I know you got to take off soon, but this seems like in a different context, I would get people grinding my gears over focusing too much on the Nordic countries, that like, this is fake socialism. Real socialism is Cuba and Bolivia and Venezuela. But if you look at how Norway dealt with a similar oil strike, they instead of just like spending it all down as it was coming in, they built up this big wealth fund with it to provide a sort of like constant stream of revenue. And that seems to me a good, lesson that like, that's what you should do. If you have a big commodity boom, you shouldn't just like enjoy the revenue at the moment and then just like hope it doesn't collapse, because, either it'll run out or the price will go down at some point. And, I think tends to demonstrate that socialism really, like, building a competent, efficient, and non-corrupt bureaucracy is maybe the hardest thing to do, and that getting, you can fool yourself by getting really head up about imperialism or U.S. aggression, even if it may be the case in certain circumstances. Like, it still matters that people are doing a good job and not stealing money, by the billions.
Right, and people should keep in mind too. Yeah, that's right, and I think that's exactly. I think that's exactly right. I mean, you have a natural resource. It has to be invested carefully, and it should be said that one of the things that people on the left want to protect in these conversations about Venezuela is that we know that Venezuela has become a kind of right-wing talking point for, like, the disasters of socialism. Where do you want? You want to be a socialist? We want to end up like Venezuela? It does no good to say that, actually it's fine in Venezuela, because this is not a place that, that's not true. That's when people's suffering is very real. On the other hand, you look at at Bolivia, which has been a geopolitical ally of Venezuela, has managed its commodity boom much more successfully, which has seen its economy grow under the presidency of Evo Morales by more than 300%. I mean, so their standards of living have improved dramatically. Now, if you were a Bolivian leftist, you were living in Bolivia, you would have certain complaints about Evo Morales. So we don't need to turn this into. Right. There'd be things to criticize. There would be things to focus on. But it's just to say that this is not the only possible outcome of a government that calls itself socialist. So I think people are defensive about that the ways that Venezuela has become this sort of right-wing talking point about the failures of socialism. I don't think it discredits socialism, but at the same time, I don't agree with those on the left who say, well, this isn't socialism because it's not, it's authoritarian or this or that. We need to understand that this also came out, it does come from the left, and it's something that leftists need to do a good job of identifying and preventing this kind of mistake from our side. We need to take ownership of that and think about what responsibilities we have to an international left that is both, that is effective, not just rhetorically satisfying, but effective at improving the lives of the poor and of working class people around the world.
Yeah, it's a definite failure mode out there. It doesn't doesn't indict the entire project, but it is something that you want to, you don't want to go there for sure.
Right.
Okay, well, any other things you want to add before I let you go? I know you're short of time.
Yeah, I just want to say, that we've touched on it briefly, but I do think that people should continue to be aware that the Trump administration. Let's not minimize the degree to which the Trump administration has been involved in this decision, and it's a little bit weird actually, because the Trump administration is not known for its hostility to authoritarian governments. Part of this seems to be that that Marco Rubio sort of got like the Venezuela job because Trump, I guess, can't be bothered to do many things. Or anything, right? Exactly. So, and Rubio representing Florida, there are many exiles, many of whom, people familiar with the Cuban exiles from a previous generation, but there are many wealthy Venezuelans who left for Florida in earlier generations of earlier waves of departures, and who are ferociously opposed to both to Chavez and to Maduro, sometimes for reasonable reasons and sometimes for reasons that are they lost out personally and are upset about that. But we have essentially the neocons within the within the Trump administration, which is I would not describe as a neoconservative administration. But there's John Bolton as national security advisor, seems to have got caught with a legal pad. Somebody zoomed in on it and said sending 5,000 troops to Colombia was written on the legal pad. So we don't know. I mean, that 5,000 troops is not enough for an invasion of a country.
No.
It's enough for like the invasion of Panama. I think it was 29,000 troops in '89. Dominican Republic in '65 was 40,000. 5,000. I mean, Venezuela is a substantial country. That's enough for extraction operation, as I understand it. So this 5,000 troops to Colombia doesn't necessarily mean that an invasion is imminent. But obviously, the situation is Trump in the United States, this very right-wing president in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, right-wing president in Colombia, and there is a sense that the right is going to seize on this moment to try and produce regime change in Venezuela.
Get
Okay.
a right wing in there.
Yeah, so that and be as involved as possible in the process to therefore produce an outcome which is as congenial and convenient to their interests as possible. And so I think what in my opinion, what the principled left-wing position should be is firm and total opposition, obviously, to any military action in Venezuela. I mean, that seems like an obvious non-starter for anybody on the left. The U.S. should not be playing a role in deciding who Venezuela's president is, right? Or in the internal politics of other countries, and that's particularly true given the history of the United States in the region. But it's true in general. I mean, the United States doesn't get to pick leaders of other countries. We barely get to pick leaders of our own country these days. So I'm not going to. It's
very true.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people are upset about that. So the shoes on the other foot here should be principled about, not supporting meddling of foreign governments in elections, including when it comes from the United States.
We need to start with democracy promotion here at home.
Absolutely. So I think that's clear. Support of a negotiated settlement, I think, is the right thing to land on effectively, but without making that a kind of apology for the failures of the government. It should be we should be realistic about what has happened here and the responsibility of the left. So I don't think that people should be trying to protect Maduro or even the legacy of Hugo Chavez that will drive people to the right, and that will drive the coalition that eventually there will be a new government in Venezuela. One hopes that happens through peaceful means. And we want that government to be as responsible and as responsive as possible. It will include elements of the opposition. It will include Chavista elements. There's been a robust sort of social movement presence in Venezuela throughout these years. Those are the foundation of left-wing politics, and you want those people to be involved. You don't want those people to face massive repression or state violence after a change in government. We don't want to make excuses for state violence now. We don't want to see it in the future turned against some other sector of society. So the outcome should be some sort of reconciliation, and you want to play a part in that process so that the coalition that emerges in a new government situation is as broadly representative and can move the situation out of the crisis that it's been for the last few years. For that reason, I don't think the U.S. has any role to play. I just don't. The U.S. government has it's not going to improve that situation, and its participation is going to give Maduro's government an opportunity to say, look at this meddling that is happening, that is sponsored by the United States. it is being, I mean, it clearly was coordinated with the United States, because Guaido was recognized immediately by the U.S. and other, and there's been reporting, that they were having these kind of conversations behind the scenes. So it is true that the U.S., meddling is an important part of the picture. It doesn't mean that there aren't, that Venezuelans are not acting for their own reasons, and that the dissatisfaction is not real. So you just sort of keep in all of those things simultaneously in mind, and support a political process that can, that can produce the best possible outcome with through peaceful negotiations. That's what we can. That's the best I think we can hope for the circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. Hands off Venezuela, and it would be, if it's bad for Maduro to be kind of looting these oil revenues, or his cronies, then it would be just as bad for a bunch of military officers and American oil companies to be doing the same thing.
So, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I imagine you got to go, right? Okay. Well, Patrick Iber, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your time, and we hope to see you again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for talking.
Welcome back. That was Patrick. We were glad to have him on. I wish I could have been there. I was there in spirit, kind of like, the Jedis, when they can be out of their body and they can oversee spiritually, but they can't really participate. They can just watch. I was doing that in a strange, creepy way. My body was teaching somewhere else.
Yeah, I had, like in that Star Wars movie where Luke appears and he's de-aged 20 years, to where his beard has just for men in it, and just
you felt it, right? Like you felt my presence. Right. Good.
You're
good.
feeding me the good takes. No, I mean, I think we covered the territory pretty well, and I think that the we hit all the main points, and I think that just like, whenever we get into these kind of disputes about like political tactics and whether one is sort of phrasing this like it reminds me of there was this huge debate for many years about in the climate change community about how you sort of could convince Republicans that that climate change is a real thing, that if you change the way that you framed things, you'd make it more likely to like this or that. And to me, that is almost impossible to actually execute, that framing, and the way that you present things is really not, it's once you say something, it gets sucked into the maelstrom of partisan politics, and you lose almost all control over it. And what really matters to me, and what I think is most important, is what is true, what is actually happening. I was gonna
ask you why that matters. This is, of course, a rhetorical device, but because I thought it's interesting where you were going there with the climate change thing, because I could almost hear someone objecting, like the Twitter people that are objecting to you, who are saying, who cares about being intellectually honest? What is and this is, I think, something we come down on the same side of all the time, but we very much, I think, see from the left this push to focus almost exclusively on what is the quote-unquote work that your argument or rhetoric is doing politically. Meaning, who cares if it's true? Are you playing into someone else's hands, or are you, framing things in a way that seeds the argument or something like that, as if nuance itself was problematic in that way. But with the with climate change, couldn't you just say that, well, yeah, you're never going to convince somebody on the opposite side, so why does reason and truth and objectivity matter? Shouldn't we just try to win the rhetorical battle any way we can? Shouldn't we just try to win politically? So I'll pose that to you briefly. I have my own thoughts, but wouldn't that be that to your own point, they're not going to listen, so why not just try to defeat the opposition and don't cede any ground? Yeah,
well, I mean, I guess, And insofar, I just feel like the connection there is very tenuous. And I think that the one thing you can sort of cling to is the fact that, whatever you're talking about, you have your facts in order, I guess. And then you sort of like move from there onto your kind of like trying to mobilize the people that actually agree with you. It's not as if it's not a sort of technocratic thing where it's like just the facts, but I think it's just a recognition of the limitations of this kind of thing, to say like, well, the rhetoric is, the important thing is if you're stopping this imperialist aggression, then that's the only thing that matters. But I think insofar as people like, I guess I would reject that premise actually, and as well, to say that being a very sort of partisan defender of Maduro, as Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, who are both incredibly fucking stupid, have done, in conversations with me online, I think that discredits the argument against imperialism, because it allows, the sort of neocons to point to people like that and say, look at these fucking cranks. Look at these absolute lunatics who are defending someone who has ruined his country. And,
right.
It associates it with wackiness. And I don't think you have to like go completely the other direction and say like Maduro is the worst person who's ever lived. But I think that denying reality, to say that Maduro is some sort of good person, it doesn't work even rhetorically. I think it has the opposite effect.
No, that's a good point. To me, and I don't know what you think about this, this tracks so similarly to our discussions on kind of Russiagate and Russia Trump stuff.
Yes.
And it's almost exactly the same rhetorical maneuver where we don't care, almost, says some portion of the left, what the actual facts on the ground are. We think that it's dangerous, right? Like the work that would be done by not blaming Hillary and the Democrats entirely for the loss, and instead aligning Putin and Russia and this foreign involvement as the real locus of responsibility. I don't care how true that is. I don't like the work it does in the argument. Therefore, I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist, as if people won't be like, but that's not true, right? Like, as if you could just wish away reality and have a persuasive rhetorical argument, right?
Yeah, and I mean it is a very similar argument, and almost the same people. It's the same people who are very, very against Russiagate, skeptical of the entire idea, despite the fairly compelling evidence now that what's Roger Stone now had the contacts with, this is the biggest, we didn't get to this in our last episode because it was recorded before this happened, but
right.
He lied about being basically the back channel to WikiLeaks, which got its hacked emails from the Russian intelligence services. So there was a pretty much direct line from Russian intelligence services on the one side to the Trump campaign on the other side. So it's the
weirdest thing, Coops. These are the same people that also can't take joy in Roger Stone going down because the FBI were the ones that arrested him. That doesn't mean that we celebrate the history of the FBI's oppression and violence against against leftists and minorities. Why is this so complicated? This is not hard. This is we like that Stone got taken down. We don't like the other things the FBI did that are bad. It doesn't mean we're making the FBI heroes writ large and generally.
No.
Russia in the past was communist. It's actually authoritarian capitalist, plutocratic now. That's not leftism, okay? Like Venezuela, insofar as terrible things and corrupt oligarchs are being helped, and insofar as anti-democratic authoritarian moves are being made, that's not leftist. So you don't need to defend it as leftist. Like I just don't. Why can't we just critique the things properly? Like I don't understand.
Yeah. Well, in this, this dispute that I got into with Blumenthal and Norton, I think it really reinforced the necessity of like making this critique, to being clear with the what went wrong in Venezuela, why is this happening, and actually what kind of character is Maduro. And
right.
There is you could never convince me that there's some sort of like hypothetical political benefit that is going to justify the idea of like more or less lying about that, what's going on. And
not only that, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
No, all yours.
I just this is amping me up. I like it. This is great. It's philosophically, theoretically, this is the problem I'm seeing. It's like I see a regime that I identify in my brain as leftist, and therefore what they do must be good because leftism is good. Except it might be the other way. It might be like, depending what they do, they may or may not be leftist, right? Like, and like, insofar as leftism is good, it's because it's democratic. It's because it's egalitarian, right? So like, in the same way that I'm going to bring in classical philosophy again, the polis or the political community isn't the same. Just because the name and the territory are the same doesn't mean it's the same regime always, right? Like, so even if you think about the United States or the city you live in, is it the same city just because the boundaries change anyway? But like 20 years ago, is it the same? Does it have the same character, the same spirit? Are the laws and the customs and the way that people live the same? And that changes the nature and the kind of essence, if you will, of the regime and how people live together, right? So like, it's kind of like you can't step in the same river twice, right? So if something that was founded on socialist principles becomes governed in a way that shifts away from those principles, you can critique that because it's deviating from the thing it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, not only that, you must critique it. You must be clear when people are not, when they are failing to do the things that were that they sort of are setting out to do. And this, I think, is a very underrated point. Chris Hayes had a tweet where he was talking about how socialism more or less lives or dies on whether or not you can create an efficient bureaucracy. And there's a very illuminating New Politics article about like basically why Venezuela is in severe economic difficulties. I'll link it in the description. And it basically, the big reason is Maduro's and his cronies have been looting money out of the exchange control mechanism that Venezuela has to basically steal the oil money. And then the price of oil fell by like half in 2014, and that was, like they covered the difference by printing money, etc. That's how you get hyperinflation. But another thing they mentioned in that article was that a lot of the things, Chavez, back when he was a president, had sort of like haphazardly nationalized a lot of industries and hadn't really paid a great deal of attention about how those things, those business enterprises were managed. And they didn't think that, it was just, it became very cronyist. And if you compare that to, for example, how Norway set up their oil company when they discovered a ton of oil, well, they paid very, very close attention about how you run a good oil company. They hired a private company to be like, teach us how to build a oil platform out in this, the North Sea, which is a very treacherous place. And they built them the oil platform. They learned how to do it. Then they built their own oil platform. So it's like taking efficient operation of bureaucracy, institutional knowledge, experience, just like being a competent and professional and sort of honorable public servant very, very, very seriously. And that, I think, is the big reason why Norway is successful and Venezuela is not. That they had they really, really, really tried. You could point to a lot of other things, but like that kind of public solidarity, the public servants who do their job in a very sort of, patriotic or however you want to call it way, that makes all the difference, I think.
That's a great point. I have a couple points to make off of that. One is that, first of all, we should kind of note the caveat that anytime you're measuring the success of a quote-unquote socialist nation state, we're doing so now in the context of global capitalism, right? So like the idea is that capitalism is global necessarily, and it means something quite different to try to operate as a socialist nation state in competition with capitalist free market economies around the world. That's one thing. The second thing is that insofar as you can still do that successfully, which I think, I don't know if this is a different discussion, but I think if you have global socialism, that means something totally different for how well run and how successful a particular nation state can be, right? And maybe you don't have nation states. That's a whole other thought. But within global capitalism, right, a socialist nation state can still be successful. And maybe what makes it more socialist, so I don't know exactly what, say, Matt Brunig's argument was, with Norway being more socialist than Venezuela. Maybe it's exactly what you were just saying. But if it is, it might be because to be socialist isn't just to have certain principles, but to be actually better at accomplishing those goals and being in an actual practice more egalitarian, which means considering how your resources should more equally redound to everyone in the population and now and in the future, right? So you have certain duties to preserve your wealth and make sure that future populations have access to it. So that's more socialist to actually do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a matter, Norway and Venezuela have been in similar positions in terms of their sort of natural resource base. I mean, Norway only found its oil relatively recently, I believe. But what Venezuela has done is basically they hit these big oil strikes, and then they use them to sort of fund current spending, and then the price collapses, and then they have this massive economic crisis. And what Norway has done is very, very gradually and step by step build up this just hyper efficient bureaucracy, which takes that oil money that they have and built up this enormous sovereign wealth fund with it, which it I mean, at least in the first instance, makes for a sort of permanent wealth stream instead of a temporary thing that could go away whenever the price of oil collapses. And secondly, has sort of socialized the means of production in a very concrete sense, to say that like the state owns a huge fraction of the wealth in Norway and a decent fraction of world wealth, like 1.3% of all of the stocks in the world. And I think that it doesn't seem obvious to me that it would have been impossible for Venezuela to sort of do that thing. We're just sort of like sitting quietly away in their little corner of the globe and build up something like that. Or trying to, not get crosswise with the United States diplomatically. I think that you certainly see now that right-wing forces in Latin America and the United States are seizing on this as a good excuse to sort of try to replace Maduro with some kind of dictator, a right-wing dictator who would probably be even more corrupt than he is. But if someone had just sort of delivered the goods, a party or an organization, without having the sort of economic crisis and without trying to steal elections or like rejigger the Constitution so they can never lose.
Yeah. It's interesting, Coops, because it seems to me that the same people that argue against criticizing, don't criticize Venezuela in any way, don't criticize Maduro in any way, aren't these the same people that would flip that, like they would lose their minds if the liberals who say don't criticize Hillary Clinton when she's running against Trump because, my God, I mean, you don't want Trump to win, do you? Isn't it the same type of logic that says we can't point out how terrible Hillary Clinton is because don't you understand the work that does that might help elect Trump? Isn't there an irony there? These are the same people that like felt fine about totally critiquing the neoliberals and Hillary Clinton, and yet it seems to be the same consequentialist logic, right?
Yeah, and I guess at the end of the day, it's we're just on a podcast, we're on Twitter. We are not powerful people, unfortunately. Very sad.
I mean, you can do a lot of pull-ups, I gotta say. I don't know if anyone's seen this. If you become $1,000 a month patron, Coops will do pull-ups on video for you. I just made that up.
Yeah.
Maybe.
$1,000 a month. I mean, I would probably do it for like $20 a month.
You heard it here first, folks.
But I think, the value, we are, for lack of a better word, kind of intellectuals. And I think the value that intellectuals can provide is trying to sort out what is happening. And
that's right.
What is it? What is going on? What is a good example? What is a bad example? And, there's a lot of people who say that, the Nordics are a stupid example. It's bad. You shouldn't try to replicate that kind of thing in the United States. And that the real socialism is Cuba and the USSR and Venezuela. And I think that's just it's just fucking stupid. That's a really blinkered idea. And you should take a hard look at the empirics, on the details, and on the ideology of the various international comparisons that we have, and sort of like see which ones work the best.
Right. And remember, ideology is political theory plus action. So it's like, what are the ideals and the theories we have about human nature and how we want to live together? And then what are the strategies we have for bringing that into being? And if your ideology ends up saying the action we should take is an authoritarian power grab, maybe that's not a good ideology.
Yeah. And I read a lot of history recently about the Russian Revolution, and I think that Lenin was not entirely irredeemable, but at the end of the day, what he did was overturn democracy. He overturned democracy and instituted a kind of authoritarian system, which was exploited by Stalin to become a just terrifying, nightmarish hellscape. And, I think that people got to be confident about the way to move forward, to not feel like you have to defend every shitty, leftist or pseudo leftist government in the world. Like, sometimes people fuck up. Like, look at all the right wing governments that fuck up, and there's a lot of ways to screw things up. And what one should do is try to learn from people's mistakes so that you don't repeat them and don't get sort of trolled into becoming a partisan of someone who is bad.
That's right. And I think that's when you get the derogatory term, you're an ideologue. I think in a sense that derogatory term makes sense. That's where it makes sense. Because it's great to have ideals and principles, but don't be so blind to the reality. And that's where nuance gets wiped away and so forth. By the way, Stalin was very, very sexy and hot as a young man. So let's just say that as many people as he killed and as terrible as he was, right? Like,
I think
so,
Lenin
you can
was
see
hotter.
how hot. What? Okay, we got to do a poll. Can we put young hot Stalin and Lenin side by side and get a? We gotta get
I'm
some
biased
objective
because
empirics on this.
bald guys.
That's true. That's pretty sexy, I gotta say. That's yeah. All right, I see what you're saying.
Stalin was
Dangerous.
very
Watch out for
short as well. If we're talking about attractiveness, he was like 5'4".
That tends to not go over well,
Yeah, unfortunately.
He has the Napoleon complex a little bit. Yeah,
Supposedly
no wonder.
Napoleon was about average height for his time. It was like 5'6".
Yeah, unfairly maligned. 5'7" or 5'6"?
Something like that, yeah.
Strange, unfortunate. So it should be the Stalin complex, is what it should be. Do you think Stalin would make up for it today with like the big truck with the big engine and like the kind of
That's a good question. You always
Try to
wonder like how people would turn out in totally different social circumstances. It's like you
Right.
imagine Hitler if the Great Depression never happened and he just like became a sort of selling. It was like he spent many years selling paintings that he would paint every day on this. Like, he was super poor for years and was just hawking paintings or having other people hawk
he could have been
them.
a starving artist.
Yeah, he could have
Did you
been
know?
for his
Did
whole
you know
life.
he went to? Did you know he went to grade school with Wittgenstein? There's a legit picture
No
of them
shit.
both in the same like grade school picture. Yeah.
Wow. Small world. At any rate, I would just say that what is happening in the world and what examples that the United States might learn from, and on both counts, I think that Venezuela is not something that we need to be really investing ourselves in defending. But that said, any proposed imperialist action, to emphasize once more, is absolutely illegitimate. We, have to work night and day to prevent that from happening, if at all possible. And let the Venezuelan people decide what needs to happen in that country.
And just the way that we can cheer for democracy and be against sanctions or imperialism, but like in Brazil, be upset that the democratically elected leader is a fucking proto-fascist. Like, we can still not like the democratic results for ideological reasons. The same is true in
Sure.
Venezuela, right? Like, we can support that they self-determine and still not be happy with the choice, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some question about, whether it's like the opposition boycotted the election in 2018.
Yeah,
but-
that's complicated.
Yeah, I mean,
complicated.
right.
Yeah.
I think, you defend democracy You say that, like, okay, you won the election. You know, if it's a right-wing election, I may not agree with that, but like that was the result. And so, we'll move to a stance of saying that if you are legitimately elected, then you need to abide by the results of the next election, which I think will be very telling in the case of Bolsonaro.
Right.
Because I would guess that he is not going to be very popular come election time next because he's not going to be able to solve any of the problems he said he would, and is going to resort to military force to cling to power.
So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, well, thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.